Haiti became to be the environment that it was. But that's still only just kind of setting up some of the causes here. All right, we have a country that has a tremendous amount of tension in it. But to really understand the tension, you need to understand the social structure of the environment. So their social structure was completely divided up by race.
Wait, so this is going under...
This would be social structure. Okay, and all this is saying is giving you numbers. So, I'm not going to ask you, how many people it is. So if you don't want to take word-for-word notes for this, this is just to kind of paint this picture for you. So the island was made up almost entirely of slaves. There's about 500, 500,000, even at sometimes up to 800,000 enslaved peoples in Haiti. All right, this is an overwhelming majority of the population, close to about 90%. All right, there was other populations of people too. The gens de couleur is French. I have no good French accent, so I probably sounded terrible to anyone who could actually speak French. That is free people of color. So this was a few different things. There were mixed race people in this. There were even slaves that had become free. There was people who immigrated from Africa not as freed people. Okay, but they were a separate class of people. Still, the rights were not equal. However, they were highly educated. Many were landowners and actually owned slaves themselves. Yes.
If they had the numbers, why didn't they just revolt?
This is called the Haitian Revolution.
Kind of like going over.
It's a good question because it's exactly what happened. And then there was a class of about 20,000 whites from France, most of whom were landowners. There was a poorer white population living on the island as well. But as long as you understand the three kind of separate divides, it'll understand the whole story.
Wait, you said we need to know the numbers?
No, you do not. As long as you know, about 90% of the island was slaves, that's the big thing. All right. And because of the numbers of people in each of these social classes, so to speak, it created an environment that had a ton of tension. All right, just like Earl was saying, this is still going under the same thing that you were typing in before. Just like Earl said, why wouldn't you just revolt? Yeah, that was kind of like a daily thing that you would kind of expect to almost always be happening with that kind of numbers. So the whole environment of the island was this 10% of the population trying to control 90%. So that wasn't just like a peaceful, we know what our roles in society are. It was constant fighting back and forth, constant struggles, and it was purely divided on race. So there was no way to change where your position was in society. So because of that, that is going to create a lot of tension. And because of this, everyone has different levels of rights. And we're going to look at here in a second and kind of throughout the week see some of those struggles for power. But it basically came down to you have a ruling class who is exploiting people in order to get wealthy. So that is going to create a ton of tension, and it is a very small percentage of the population that has any power whatsoever. Some of this stuff is things that I had said previously on the last slide. Does everybody have this down? Can I move forward?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So one thing to think about is Haiti is not that large of a place. So to have sometimes close to 1 million people, it's actually pretty crowded there. I know that you think of today, like if you think of the DC area, we have about 10 million people living in the greater DC area. But, you know, we also have things like skyscrapers and tall buildings and all things like that. They didn't have any of that, so at this point in time, it actually was pretty, like the cities would be pretty congested with people. All right. The pre-revolution. So essentially, Haiti is one of the most important places for the French government because that is where they're making most of their money. Okay, and it comes from the use of slave labor for two main crops. Sugarcane, which would be grown in areas that had flatter, more open lands, and then coffee was more in the mountainous areas. Okay, they're two things that are definitely commodity items that people are willing to pay a lot of money for. Because of this, because they're able to produce so much of this using slavery, they've actually produced 40% of the world's sugar and 50% of the world's coffee. That's amazing to think about, especially when you consider the island that they're on. They actually only have a third of the island, right? The other 2/3 is Spanish owned. Okay, so this small area is creating an unbelievable amount of resources. Now, does anybody know what thing that's made from sugar that everybody liked at that time period? So sugarcane is where they get the sugar from. What do they use it to make? Yeah. Molasses. And what does molasses make?
Syrup.
Pirates like it.
Rum.
Rum.
Oh. I just thought about pirate video on your
So one thing that's interesting to think is I think if you were to transport back in history, you'd see there's a lot of more alcoholics in history than there are now. There was a lot of people who I think were drunk basically all the time. So it's just kind of interesting. But so anyways, people that was one of the biggest reasons why sugar was such a commodity is because it was used to make rum, and rum was a very, very popular drink at the time.
Didn't they also drink alcohol because the water wasn't clean?
Yeah, well, so that is true. But drinking liquor wouldn't really help protect them. I mean, they drank like beer and wine too because water was dirty. But yeah, you're right, because it kills the germs, the alcohol does. And then because of this, Haiti is the richest colony in the entire world from these two crops. All right. Okay, so there's a couple things to go over here. We're going to go into kind of some specifics about sugarcane.
I love sugar.
Go back a place. Yeah.
Yes. So I just showed you guys a picture of sugarcane. If you didn't see it, I'll put it back up in a second, but people are still finishing up their notes. Sugarcane is one of the hardest things, one of the physically, like the harshest things to grow because it takes a tremendous amount of work to actually turn it into something that you would think of as like an edible process or an edible thing that you'd eat. Okay. First things first, I want you to notice how tall it is. Okay, so it's not like if you're thinking of a cornfield. Okay, corn is like what, maybe 7 feet tall, and you just pick the things off. Okay, sugarcane is a lot like it's like a lot like bamboo. Have you guys ever seen that? How it's like it's wood, it's flexible, but it's still wood, and it's pretty sturdy. So because of this, in order to get the sugar cane and the part in it that's actually sweet, you have to, with blades, hack at the stalks, which is pretty dangerous when you're doing it that repeated motion over and over again and expect it to work at an incredibly high pace. So because of this, a lot of the issues that were facing slaves was hurting themselves with the blades. Also, being forced to work at a pace obviously is hard in Haiti. It's hot, but just the crop in and of itself is much more harsh than you'd think of as other crops, even like in the South, the American South with cotton and indigo. Things like sugarcane are a lot harder to actually harvest. Now, because of this, the only way to prevent any sort of revolts would be to have very violent and harsh punishments. So part of this process was the plantation owners were terrible. This is looked at as one of the harshest places in the world, not just because of actually producing the sugar cane, but because of the conditions that we've seen when we look at primary sources. So that's what we're going to be looking at today for the end of class here. Is I want you guys to be answering the question from these primary sources: did Haiti have the harshest, most violent, worst slavery in the world? Okay, it's often looked at that way. So there's a few primary sources that you will be looking at. There's 2 political cartoons and then 1 passage that you read. What I would like you guys to do in that last box is, using these primary sources, please write in a few sentences with some evidence your thoughts on the topic. Okay. Any questions with what you're supposed to be doing? None. Okay. So you have all the primary